As the summer of 1986 approached, the editors at DC Comics were preparing for the biggest creative shakeup in the history of the company. The year-long Crisis on Infinite Earths maxi series had ended several months before, and now the time had come for the universe-changing implications of that series to reach the pages of DC's monthly titles. Of those implications, arguably the most significant were the ones pertaining to the company's standard-bearer, Superman, whose character history and present-day status quo were about to undergo a total reboot. But before that reboot began, there was time to grant the Man of Steel something that few monthly comic book superheroes ever got: an ending. It was the end of an era at DC for more than just the stars of the comics. Legendary editor Julius Schwartz, who had worked at DC for over 40 years, led the transition from the Golden Age to the Silver Age, conceived the Justice League of America, oversaw the revamp of the Batman comics in the 1960s, and been the editor of the Superman titles for the last 15 years, was retiring. The final adventure of the pre-crisis Superman would play out in two parts: Superman number 423 and Action Comics number 583, the last two Superman comics Julie Schwartz would edit before his retirement. Schwartz's idea was simple. These were not actually going to be the last Superman comics ever published, but what if they were? What if this really was the final adventure of Superman? What should that story be? What should be the fates of not only Superman himself, but Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, Perry White, Lana Lang, and others in the Man of Steel's supporting cast? What about Superman's most memorable antagonists? What should become of Lex Luthor, or Brainiac, or Bizarro? To tell this story, Schwartz envisioned the ultimate Superman creative team. The art would be provided by penciler Curt Swan, one of the greatest artists in the history of DC Comics, and the most celebrated and influential artist to ever work on Superman, with inks by George Perez, who had just penciled Crisis on Infinite Earths and finished a definitive run on New Teen Titans the year before, and Kurt Schaffenberger, who had been a penciler and inker at DC for decades, helping to define the looks of Lois Lane, Superboy, and Captain Marvel, known today as Shazam, among others. To write this Superman story, to end all Superman stories, Julius Schwartz could think of no one better than the man who had written the first Superman story, co-creator of Superman, Jerry Siegel. Schwartz offered the job to Siegel at the 1985 San Diego Comic-Con, and Siegel enthusiastically accepted. Unfortunately, legal issues prevented Siegel from actually writing the story, and Schwartz was left scrambling to find a suitable replacement. Who could possibly pinch hit for the co-creator of Superman to write the last Superman story? After learning that Jerry Siegel wouldn't be available to write the story, Julie Schwartz was having breakfast with another writer. He explained about the problem he was having in finding someone to write his final issues of Superman and Action Comics, and after Schwartz had told his story, his breakfast companion stood up and said, "If you let anybody but me write that story, I'll kill you." That writer was Alan Moore. Unfortunately for us and Julie Schwartz, he got the job. A writer for DC since 1983, Moore was in the middle of a critically acclaimed run on Swamp Thing and was also at work writing the medium redefining maxi series Watchmen, the first issue of which would be published the same month as Julius Schwartz's final issues of Superman and Action Comics. Plus, the previous year, for Superman Annual number 11, Moore and his Watchmen collaborator Dave Gibbons had produced For the Man Who Has Everything, one of the most critically acclaimed Superman stories of that or any other decade. So yeah, as far as replacements for Jerry Siegel go, you can't do much better than Alan Moore. The story Moore wrote is titled Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, and it begins in Superman number 423 like this. This is an imaginary story, which may never happen, but then again may, about a perfect man who came from the sky and did only good. It tells of his twilight, when the great battles were over and the great miracles long since performed, of how his enemies conspired against him, and of that final war in the snow-blind wastes beneath the northern lights, of the two women he loved and of the choice he made between them, and how finally all the things he had were taken from him save one. It ends with a wink. It begins in a quiet Midwestern town, one summer afternoon in the quiet Midwestern future. Away in the big city, people still sometimes glance up hopefully from the sidewalks, glimpsing a distant speck in the sky. But no, it's only a bird, only a plane. Superman died 10 years ago. This is an imaginary story. Aren't they all? Though originally conceived as the last story to feature the Earth 1 Superman, Moore's script included certain details that contradicted the established continuity of Earth 1, so it announces itself instead as an imaginary story. But I think those beautiful opening lines I just read to you transcend any pedantic fussiness over continuity or which specific version of the DC universe the story takes place in, and establish this story as being not only outside of continuity, but outside of time. A story that is not about any one variant of Superman, but which is, at its heart, about all versions of Superman, about the soul and essence of the character itself. As that opening caption explains, it is 10 years since the death of Superman. A reporter for the Daily Planet pays a visit to Lois Lane, now Lois Elliott, married and the mother of a young son. The reporter has come to interview Lois for a feature in an upcoming memorial edition of The Planet, to ask her about the last days of Superman. Lois sets the scene. The time leading up to Superman's death was relatively quiet. Lex Luthor hadn't been heard from for a while. Brainiac had been destroyed, all but his head, that is, which hadn't been recovered. Most of Superman's other major adversaries were gone, some of whom having killed each other. As a result, Superman was spending a lot of time in space, doing scientific research. Superman returns from one of his space missions to find carnage in the streets of Metropolis, fires, smashed cars, toppled buildings. The cause of this destruction? Bizarro, who just showed up out of nowhere and started wrecking everything in sight, laughing as he did it. Superman enters the department store where Bizarro retreated to confront him and learns that Bizarro's rampage began long before he reached Metropolis and has been far more catastrophic than Superman could possibly have imagined. Bizarro explains how, following his warped backwards logic, he realized that if he wanted to truly be the opposite of Superman, he needed to take some extreme measures. So, because Superman had come to Earth as a baby after his home planet of Krypton had been accidentally destroyed, Bizarro has now come to Earth as an adult after destroying his home planet of Bizarro World on purpose. Superman is horrified, but blowing up his home planet, along with everyone on it, was just the start of Bizarro's campaign. Because Superman never kills, Bizarro has been doing the opposite. He cheerfully informs Superman that he's been killing lots of people since he got to Earth. But in order to truly be Superman's opposite, there's one more thing he needs to do. Because Superman is alive, Bizarro must be dead. So he pulls out a chunk of blue kryptonite, the kind that is fatal to Bizarro, and commits suicide. Now, if you've never read this story before, you might be thinking, geez, this seems kind of dark for a last Superman story. Let me assure you, you have no idea. We're just getting started. The next thing that happens is that Clark Kent receives a package at work containing a half dozen or so Superman action figures, which come to life and blast Clark with their heat vision, burning off his suit and revealing his secret identity to all of his co-workers. These murderous Migos were sent by the Toyman and the Prankster, but how did the Toyman and the Prankster know about Superman's secret identity? Why, they got Superman's childhood best friend Pete Ross to tell them before they tortured him to death and sent his corpse over in a crate. I told you. Superman apprehends the Toyman and the Prankster, neither of whom seem able to explain what motivated them to commit such a brutal crime all of a sudden. Meanwhile, after a long search, Lex Luthor discovers the head of Brainiac buried in the Arctic snow. Lex is hoping to use Brainiac's technology to his own advantage, but Brainiac, who is still alive, has other ideas. He takes over Lex's body and declares that with Lex's help, he's going to rebuild his destroyed spaceship and use it to take his revenge against Superman. After more supervillains, a gang of Metallos this time, attack the Daily Planet, Superman gathers up his closest friends and takes them to the Fortress of Solitude for their protection. That night, he receives a visit from the Legion of Superheroes, who have with them a younger version of Supergirl who happened to be visiting them in the 30th century. This is especially painful for Superman since in his present era, Supergirl is dead. Legion member Brainiac 5 presents Superman with a gift, a small golden statue of himself, explaining cryptically that they wanted to give this to Superman now because 30th century history records this as a very important time in Superman's life. The Legion and Supergirl depart for the future, and part 1 of the story ends with a deeply shaken Superman sitting in the trophy room of the fortress, with only his dog Crypto for company, weeping. As part 2 begins in Action Comics 583, Lois is continuing her conversation with the reporter when her husband, burly, mustachioed working man Jordan Elliott, comes home. He shakes hands with the reporter. Does he mind Lois talking about her ex-boyfriend Superman? Heck no! Superman was nothing special. Working slobs like me are the real heroes, Jordy says before excusing himself to check on the baby. With the ball and chain out of the room, Lois continues her story. With his friends relatively safe behind the walls of the Fortress of Solitude, Superman destroys the giant golden key that unlocks the entrance to the fortress. Not long after, Brainiac arrives in his reconstructed ship along with his new ally, Kryptonite Man. They are soon joined by more visitors from the 30th century, the Legion of Supervillains, who explain that history records that today, Superman met his greatest foe in battle and was seen no more. With victory guaranteed, the evil Legion has come to join in the fun. Brainiac is reluctant at first to accept their help, but when he realizes that other superheroes will probably show up eventually to fight alongside Superman, he welcomes the Legion of Supervillains and erects a powerful force field around the fortress for good measure. A siege commences. Superman is able to destroy most of Brainiac's weapons from long range using his heat vision, but he can't get close because of the presence of Kryptonite Man. Meanwhile, several of Superman's friends have arrived on the scene and are trying to punch their way through the force field. I love the adorable detail of Batman and Robin standing there wailing away at the force field with sticks. It's the thought that counts, guys. That night inside the fortress, as the barrage subsides for the time being, Superman has a heart-to-heart with Perry White, where he confesses that he loves both Lana Lang and Lois Lane, but that Lois is who he would want to spend the rest of his life with. Only he hasn't told that to Lois because he doesn't want to hurt Lana. He calls himself a coward and feels guilty that both Lana and Lois have, as he puts it, wasted their love on him. Elsewhere in the fortress, Lana and Jimmy Olsen find samples of power-granting substances in Superman's trophy room and transform themselves into superheroes so they can help fight off Brainiac. After she gains super hearing, Lana overhears Superman telling Perry about his love for Lana and his greater love for Lois, and flies outside, determined to prove that, as she says to Jimmy, nobody loved him better than us. The two of them do pretty good at first. Jimmy, who has gained elastic powers, works on shutting down the force field generator, while Lana, with her super strength and ability to fly, knocks out Kryptonite Man and confronts Brainiac. Lex Luthor is able to overcome Brainiac's control and will his own personality to the front just long enough to beg Lana to kill him, which she does, snapping his neck with a single blow. Lana's success is short-lived, however. Cosmic King of the Legion of Supervillains uses his abilities to rob Lana of her superpowers, and Lightning Lord fatally electrocutes her. Enraged by Lana's death, Jimmy abandons his efforts at the force field generator and attacks, but he is killed by Brainiac, who has reanimated the corpse of Lex Luthor and now announces his intention to nuke the Fortress of Solitude. But while this is happening, the Legion of Supervillains notice something strange. Well, something strange besides the broken-necked carcass of Lex Luthor shambling around like a zombie wearing a Brainiac helmet. Before he died, Jimmy Olsen succeeded in disabling the force field generator, but the force field is still up. Brainiac is like, "Never mind, we have to nuke the site from the ground, it's the only way to be sure." The nuke doesn't destroy the fortress, but it does blow a big hole in the wall, allowing Kryptonite Man to rush inside. He cries out for Superman, but instead he gets Krypto the Superdog, who viciously attacks and kills him. Sadly, Krypto defeats Kryptonite Man at the cost of his own life, as moments later he succumbs to kryptonite poisoning. We having fun yet? Superman's dog is dead. We good? The Legion of Supervillains enter the fortress and cut off Superman as he's attempting to move Lois to safety. The villains let it slip that they killed Lana, and Superman flies into a rage so scary that the villains immediately give up and return to the 30th century. The only threat left, so it seems, is Brainiac, but as it happens, that one takes care of itself. As Superman and Lois watch in horror and confusion, Lex's body finally gives out and collapses. Brainiac detaches himself and crawls towards Superman, still issuing threats, but within another few seconds, his circuits fail, and he dies as well. And yet, the force field still surrounds the fortress. Superman ponders that mystery while Lois examines the gold statue given to him by the Legion of Superheroes. Then, Superman has an epiphany. He realizes that there is only one of his adversaries who could possibly be responsible for the chaos and carnage of the last few days. Superman calls this enemy out, and the enemy appears. Mr. Mxyzptlk. Mixie admits that, yes, he has been the mastermind behind everything, Bizarro, Toyman and Prankster, the Metallos, Brainiac and Lex, all of it. Why? Because he was bored. He's an immortal being. He's been passing the time being mischievous for the last 2,000 years, and it's gotten old. So he's making a change. For the next 2,000 years, he's going to be evil. And he's going to start by killing Superman. Mixie mutates into a larger and more frightening form than anything we've seen before and chases Superman and Lois back inside the fortress. As Superman prepares to wage a hopeless battle against Mixie, Lois finally realizes why the Legion of Superheroes gave this gold statue to Superman. The statue is holding a Phantom Zone projector. Superman rushes to the Phantom Zone chamber, grabs the projector, and aims it at Mxyzptlk. Realizing what's about to happen, Mixie recites his own name backwards in order to transport himself back to the fifth dimension, but he does so at the same moment the projector sends him to the Phantom Zone. The result? Mxyzptlk is killed, ripped in half between the two dimensions. There is victory, but no triumph. Superman is despondent. He has intentionally killed someone. Lois tells him he had no choice, that he's done nothing wrong, but Superman disagrees. "I broke my oath," he says. "Nobody has the right to kill. Not Mxyzptlk, not you, not Superman, especially not Superman." With that, Superman turns from Lois, steps through the door of a room labeled as the Gold Kryptonite Storage Chamber, gives Lois a final smile over his shoulder, and disappears inside. "I never saw Superman again," Lois tells the reporter. When the other superheroes entered the fortress, Superwoman and Captain Marvel forced open the door to the Gold Kryptonite Chamber, but it was empty. Gold Kryptonite robs Superman of his superpowers. Everyone assumed that he left the Fortress of Solitude through a hidden passageway they discovered in the chamber and walked outside, where he froze to death, lost forever to the endless Arctic snow. The reporter's like, "Well, thanks," and packs up to go. Jordan appears with baby Jonathan, and together they bid farewell to the reporter. Once he's gone, Lois turns to Jordan like, "You were a little hard on Superman earlier, saying he was overrated and all." But Jordan says he was overrated. So wrapped up in himself, thinking the world couldn't get along without him. While they've been talking, baby Jonathan has been sitting on the floor playing with a lump of coal he took out of a fancy brass bucket near the fireplace. As Lois and Jordan walk out of the room, we see that Jonathan has compressed the lump of coal into a diamond. Huh. I guess all babies can do that. I never knew. They talk about dinner. Lois suggests pizza, followed by a bottle of wine. And then, she says, I figure we just live happily ever after. Sound good to you? And Jordan turns to close the bedroom door, gives us a familiar wink, and says, Lois, my love, what do you think? So, there's a lot about this story to admire. The first thing that jumps out, and hopefully this comes across in the images I've shared here as I've been going through my summary, is how gorgeous the artwork is. Curt Swan has very few equals when it comes to drawing superhero comics, particularly Superman, and he was rarely any better than he is here. The Superman of Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow is the clean, classic, iconic figure we're familiar with from the simpler days of the Silver Age, but with the emotional range and depth necessary to tell this story. And Swan is just as good when rendering the more macabre details, such as Brainiac controlling the corpse of Lex Luthor, his head lolling lifelessly to the side, eyes rolled back, mouth hung open. It's kind of upsetting. Speaking of those darker elements, yeah, this story gets pretty bleak. Beloved characters die in really vicious, really sad ways. Superman kills the bad guy. But unlike the creators of other superhero stories, who are obsessed with making them as gritty and grim dark as possible, Alan Moore has a point to make through all of this brutality. Yes, some of the character deaths serve a plot function. Killing Lana is a pretty simple way to resolve Superman's conflict in having to choose between her and Lois, for example, but it goes beyond that. This is the Silver Age Superman. In spirit, if not literally the same character, imaginary story, and all of that. And he's drawn by Curt Swan, the artist who defined his look and his style during that era. He's the Superman most of the people who read this story when it was published in 1986 grew up with. And in this story, and in reality, where the defining tone of the superhero genre was shifting towards something a lot less cheerful and carefree, he finds himself facing a world he struggles to understand, a world where he no longer fits. The whimsy of the Silver Age is being confronted by the grimmer, more cynical, less hopeful reality of the modern age. That, ultimately, is what this story is about. That's what makes Superman's struggle so compelling, and what makes the resolution to that struggle so brilliant. Superman's greatest adversary in this story turns out to be Mr. Mxyzptlk, surely the strangest and silliest of all the members of his rogues gallery, except not this time. This time, Mixie is no longer the trouble-making pest of the Golden and Silver Ages. He's a menacing, murdering threat to the lives of everyone on the planet. Just the sort of villain who would become all too common in the pages of Superman comics throughout the rest of the 1980s and into the 1990s. In order to defeat him, Superman has to kill him. But through the act of killing Mxyzptlk, Superman proves himself unworthy of his powers. You may disagree. You may think the killing of Mxyzptlk is completely justified and that Superman has nothing to feel bad about. That's certainly how Lois feels. But it doesn't matter if you agree that Superman killing Mixie makes him unworthy of being Superman. What matters is what that decision tells us about the character of Superman. He believes that no one, most especially someone with his power, should have the right to decide for themselves to take the life of another person. And when he is placed in a situation where he has to take the life of one person to save countless others, he does it, but then immediately renders himself powerless because in his mind, he has disqualified himself from being Superman. But best and most beautifully of all, it's that moment of personal failure, that breaking of his oath, that opens the door to the happy ending he truly deserves. He takes away his superpowers with gold kryptonite. I've always found that to be a poetic touch, as basically Superman uses an artifact of the Silver Age to craft his exit from the modern age. And then he changes his name, adopts a new secret identity, and settles down to marry and raise kids with Lois Lane. He gets to live happily ever after. And he gets there in a way that doesn't feel arbitrary or make him seem selfish or like a quitter. He experiences almost unimaginable losses, the deaths of friends, the exposure of his double identity as Clark Kent. As the opening narration of Superman 423 tells us, almost everything he loves is taken from him. But he endures. He saves the world one last time. He stays true to himself. And for that and for all the immeasurable good he has done in his career, he is rewarded with love, family, and peace. Superman, as a regular Joe named Jordan Elliott, will live on, but the never-ending battle is over. This wasn't the final Superman story, of course. The Superman Monthly and Action Comics took a 3-month hiatus, and when they returned, the title of Superman was changed to The Adventures of Superman, and both books now starred the new post-crisis Superman, who went on to become the Superman most people watching this video grew up with. Those of you who read the comics, anyway. That's just the nature of a medium like comic books, and a character like Superman. On those pages, inside those panels, new adventures are always on the horizon. Change is inevitable, yet somehow never permanent. And the only real endings are the imaginary ones. And as far as endings go, the one we get in Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow is about as good as it gets. The best ending possible for the best Superman ever.